Welcome back, everybody, to Dolan's Cadillac, a story by Stephen King from the book Nightmares and Dreamscapes. I grabbed the cones again, replacing them as fast as I could. Two of them spilled out of my hands and rolled down into the gully. I chased after them, panting. I tripped over a rock in the dark, fell sprawling, and got up quickly with dust on my face and blood dripping from one palm. The car was closer now. Soon it would appear over the last rise before the detour junction, and in the glow thrown by his high beams, the driver would see a man in jeans and a t-shirt trying to replace road cones while his van stood idling where no vehicle that didn't belong to the Nevada State Highway Department was supposed to be. I got the last cone in place and ran back to the sign. I tugged too hard. It swayed and almost fell over. As the approaching car's headlight began to brighten on the rise to the east, I suddenly became convinced it was a Nevada State Trooper. The sign was back where it had been, and if it wasn't, it was close enough. I sprinted for the van, got in, and drove over the next rise. Just as I cleared it, I saw headlights splash over the rise behind me. Had he seen me in the dark, with my own lights out? I didn't think so. I sat back against the seat, eyes closed, waiting for my heart to slow down. At last, as the sound of the car bouncing and bucketing its way down the detour faded out, it did. I was here, safe behind the detour. It was time to get to work. Beyond the rise, the road descended to a long, straight flat. 2/3 of the way along this straight stretch, the road simply ceased to exist. It was replaced by piles of dirt and a long, wide stretch of crushed gravel. Would they see that and stop? Turn around? Or would they keep on going, confident that there must be an approved way through this? Since they had not seen any other detour signs. Too late to worry about it now. I picked a spot about 20 yards into the flat, but still a quarter of a mile short of the place where the road dissolved. I pulled over to the side of the road, worked my way into the back of the van, and opened the back doors. I slid out a couple of boards and muscled the equipment. Then I rested and looked up at the cold desert stars. "Here we go, Elizabeth," I whispered to them. It seemed I felt a cold hand stroke the back of my neck. The compressor made a racket and the jackhammer was even worse. But there was no help for it. The best I could hope for was to be done with the first stage of the work before midnight. If it went on much longer than that, I was going to be in trouble anyway, because I had only a limited quantity of gasoline for the compressor. Never mind. Don't think of who might be listening and wonder what fool would be running a jackhammer in the middle of the night. Think about Dolan. Think about the Grey Sedan DeVille. Think about the Arc of Descent. I marked off the dimensions of the grave first, using white chalk, the tape measure from my toolbox, and the figures my mathematician friend had worked out. When I was done, a rough rectangle not quite 5 feet wide by 42 feet long glimmered in the dark. At the near end, it flared wide. Sorry, guys. In the gloom, that flare did not look so much like a funnel as it had on a graph paper, where my mathematician friend first sketched it. In the gloom, it looked like a gaping mouth at the end of the long, straight windpipe. All the better to eat you with, my dear, I thought, and smiled in the dark. I drew 20 more lines across the box, making stripes 2 feet wide. Last, I drew a single vertical line down the middle, creating a grid of 42 near squares, 2 feet by 2.5. The 43rd segment was the shovel-shaped flare at the end. Then I rolled up my sleeves, pull-started the compressor, and went back to square one. The work went faster than I had any right to hope. But not as fast as I had dared to dream. Does it ever? It would have been better if I could have used the heavy equipment, but that would come later. The first thing was to carve up the squares of paving. I was not done by midnight, and not by 3 in the morning, when the compressor ran out of gas. I had anticipated this might happen, and was equipped with a siphon for the van's gas tank. I got as far as unscrewing the gas cap, but when the smell of gasoline hit me, I simply screwed the cap back on and lay down flat in the back of the van. No more, not tonight. I couldn't. In spite of the work gloves I had worn, my hands were covered with big blisters, many of them now weeping. My whole body seemed to vibrate from the steady, punishing beat of a jackhammer, and my arms felt like tuning forks gone mad. My head ached. My teeth ached. My back tormented me. My spine felt as if it had been filled with ground glass. I had cut my way through 28 squares. 28. 14 to go. And that was only the start. Never, I thought. It's impossible. Can't be done. That cold hand again. Yes, my darling, yes. The ringing in my ears was subsided a little now. Every once in a while I could hear an approaching engine, and then it would subside to a drone on the right as it turned onto the detour and started around the loop. The highway department had created to bypass the construction. Sorry. Tomorrow was Saturday. Sorry, today. Today was Saturday. Dolan was coming on Sunday. No time. Yes, my darling. The blast had torn her to pieces. My darling had been torn to pieces for telling the truth to the police about what she had seen. For refusing to be intimidated, for being brave. And Dolan was still driving around in his Cadillac and drinking 20-year-old scotch while his Rolex gleamed on his wrist. I'll try, I thought. And then I fell into a dreamless sleep that was like death. I woke up with the sun, already hot at 8 o'clock, shining on my face. I sat up and screamed, my throbbing hands flying to the small of my back. Work? Cut up another 14 chunks of asphalt? I couldn't even walk. But I could walk, and I did. Moving like a very old man on his way to the shuffleboard game, I worked my way to the glove compartment and opened it. I had put a bottle of epinephrine, or Ampirin, sorry guys, there in case of such a morning after. Had I thought I was in shape? Had I really? Well, that was quite funny, wasn't it? I took 4 of the Empyrean with water, waited 15 minutes for them to dissolve in my stomach, and then wolfed a breakfast of dried fruit and cold Pop-Tarts. I looked over to where the compressor and the jackhammer waited. The yellow skin of the compressor already seemed to sizzle in the morning sunshine. Leading up to it on either side of my incision were the neatly cut squares of asphalt. Once again, as I said before, this is all uncut. I didn't want to go over there and pick up that jackhammer. I thought of Harvey Blocker saying, "You ain't never gonna be strong, Bubba. Some people and plants take hold in the sun. Some wither up and die. Why are you pulling this crap on your system?" She was in pieces, I croaked. I loved her, and she was in pieces. As a cheer, it was never going to replace "Go Bears" or "Hook 'em Horns," but it got me moving. I siphoned gas from the van's tank, gagging at the taste and the stink, holding on to my breakfast only by a grim act of will. I wondered briefly what I was going to do if the road crew had drained the diesel from their machines before going home for the long weekend, and quickly shoved the thought out of my mind. It made no sense to worry over things I couldn't control. More and more, I felt like a man who has jumped out of the bay of a B-52 with a parasol in his hand instead of a parachute on his back. I carried the gasoline over the compressor and poured it into the tank. I had to use my left hand to curl the fingers of my right around the handle of the compressor starter cord. When I pulled, more blisters broke, and as the compressor started up, I saw thick pus dripping out of my fist. Never make it. Please, darling. I walked over to the jackhammer and started it again. The first hour was the worst, and then the steady pounding of the jackhammer combined with the Empyrean seemed to numb everything. My back, my hand, my head. I finished cutting out the last block of asphalt by 11. It was time to see how much I remembered of what Tinker had told me about jump-starting road equipment. I went staggering and flapping back to my van and drove 1.5 miles down the road to where the road construction was going on. I saw my machine almost at once. A big case Jordan bucket loader with a grapple and pincers. attachment on the back. $135,000 worth of rolling stock. I had driven a Caterpillar for Blocker, but this one would be pretty much the same. I hoped. I climbed up into the cab and looked at the diagram printed on the head of the stick shift. It looked just the same as the one on my cat. I ran the pattern once or twice. There was some resistance at first because some grit had found its way into the gearbox. The guy who drove this baby hadn't put it down in his sand flaps, and his foreman hadn't checked him. Blocker would have checked and docked the driver $5, long weekend or not. His eyes, his half admiring, half contemptuous eyes. What would he think of an errand like this? Never mind. This was no time to be thinking of Harvey Blocker. This was a time to be thinking of Elizabeth and Dolan. There was a piece of burlap on the steel floor of the cab. I lifted it, looking for the key. There was no key there, of course. Tink's voice in my mind. Shit. A kid could jumpstart one of these babies, white bread. Ain't nothing to it. At least the car's got an ignition lock on it. New ones do, anyway. Look here. No, not where the key goes. You ain't got no key. Why you want to look where the key goes? Look under here. See these wires hanging down? I looked now and saw the wires hanging down. Looking just as they had when Tinker pointed them out to me. Red, blue, yellow, and green. I paired the insulated form from an inch of each and then took a twist of copper wire from my back pocket. Okay, white bread, listen up. Cause we may be gonna give Q&A later, you dig me? You gonna wire the red and the green? You won't forget that. Cause it's like Christmas. That kid takes care of your ignition. I used my wire to hold the bare places on the red and green wires of the Case Jordan's ignition together. The desert wind hooted, thin, like the sound of someone blowing over the top of a soda bottle. Sweat ran down my neck and into my shirt, where it caught and tickled. Now you just got the blue and the yellow. You ain't gonna wire them. You just gonna touch them together, and you're gonna make sure you ain't touching no bare wire, weather own self, when you do it either. Lest you wanna make some hot electrified water in your jockeys, my man. The blue and the yellow, the ones turn the starter. Off you go. When you feel like you had enough of the joyride, you just pull the red and the green wires apart. Like turning off the key you don't have. I touched the blue and the yellow wires together. A big yellow spark jumped up and I recoiled, striking the back of my head on one of the metal posts at the rear of the cab. Then, I leaned forward and touched them together again. The motor turned over, coughed, and the bucket loader took a sudden, spasmodic lurch forward. I was thrown into the rudimentary dashboard, the left side of my face striking the steering bar. I'd forgotten to put the damn transmission in neutral and had almost lost an eye as a result. I could almost hear Tink laughing. I fixed that, and then tried the wires again. The motor turned over, It coughed once, puffing a dirty brown smoke signal into the air to be torn away by the ceaseless wind. And then the motor just went on cranking. I kept trying to tell myself the machine was just in rough shape. A man who'd go off without putting the sand flaps down, after all, was apt to forget anything. But I became more and more sure that they had drained the diesel, just as I had feared. And then just as I was about to give up and look for something, I could use a dipstick to loader's fuel tank. All the better to read the bad news with, my dear. The motor bellowed into life. I let the wires go. The bare patch of the blue one was smoking, and goosed the throttle. When it was running smoothly, I geared it into first, swung it around, and started back toward the long brown rectangular cut neatly into the westbound lane of the highway. The rest of the day was a long, bright hell of roaring engine and blazing sun. The driver of the Case Jordans had forgotten to mount his sand flaps, but he had remembered to take his sun umbrella. Well, the old gods laugh sometimes, I guess. No reason why. They just do. And I guess the old gods have a twisted sense of humor. It was almost 2 o'clock before I got all of the asphalt chunks down into the ditch. Because I had never achieved any real degree of delicacy with the pincers, and with the spade-shaped piece at the end, I had to cut it in two, and then drag each of the chunks down into the ditch by hand. I was afraid that if I used the pincers, I would break them. When all the asphalt pieces were down in the ditch, I drove the bucket loader back down to the road equipment. I was getting low on fuel. It was time to siphon. I stopped at the van, got the hose, and found myself staring, hypnotized, at the big jerry can of water. I tossed the siphon away for the time being and crawled into the back of the van. I poured water over my face and neck and chest and screamed with pleasure. I knew that if I drank I would vomit, but I had to drink. So I did, and I vomited. Not getting up to do it, but only turning my head to one side and then crab crawling as far away from the mess as I could. Then I slept again, and when I woke up it was nearly dusk, and somewhere a wolf was howling at a new moon rising in the purple sky. In the dying light, the cut I had made really did look like a grave. The grave of some mythical ogre. Goliath, maybe? Never, I told the long hole in the asphalt. Please, Elizabeth whispered back. Please, for me. I got 4 more Empyrean out of the glove compartment and swallowed them down. For you, I said. I parked a Case Jordan with its fuel tank close to the tank of the bulldozer and used the crowbar to pry off the caps on both. A dozer jockey on the state crew might get away with forgetting to drop the sand flaps on his vehicle. But with forgetting to lock the fuel cap in these days of $1.05 diesel, never. I got the fuel running from the dozer into my loader and waited, trying not to think, watching the moon rise higher and higher in the sky. After a while, I drove back to the cut in the asphalt and started to dig. Running a bucket loader by moonlight was a lot easier than running a jackhammer under the broiling desert sun. But it was still slow work because I was determined that the floor of my excavation could have exactly the right slant. Should. As a consequence, I frequently consulted the carpenter's level I'd brought with me. That meant stomping the loader, getting down, measuring, and climbing up into the peak seat again. No problem. Ordinarily, but by midnight my body had stiffened up, and every moment sent a shriek of pain through my bones and muscles. My back was the worst. I began to fear I had done something fairly unpleasant to it. But that, like everything else, was something I would have to worry about later. If a hole 5 feet deep as well as 42 feet long and 5 feet wide had been required, it really have been impossible. Of course, bucket loader or not, I might just as well have planned to send him into outer space or drop the Taj Mahal on him. The total yield of such dimension is over 1,000 cubic feet of earth. You gotta create a funnel shape that will suck your bad aliens in, my mathematician friend had said. And then you've got to create an inclined plane that pretty much mimes the arc of descent. He drew one on another sheet of graph paper. That means that your intergalactic rebels, or whatever they are, only need to remove half as much Earth as the figures initially show. In this case, he scribbled on a worksheet and beamed 525 cubic feet, chicken fed. One man could do it. I had believed so. 2, once upon a time, but I had not reckoned on the heat, the blisters, the exhaustion, the steady pain in my back. Stop for a minute, but not too long. Measure the slant of the trench. It's not as bad as you thought it is, darling. At least it's roadbed and not desert hardpan. I moved more slowly along the length of the grave as the hole got deeper. My hands were bleeding now as I worked with the controls. Ram the drop lever all the way forward until the bucket lay on the ground. Drop lever, not lever. Pull back on the drop lever and shove the one that extended the armature with a high hydraulic whine. Watch as the bright oiled metal slid out of the dirty orange casing, pushing the bucket into the dirt. Every now and then a spark would flash as the bucket slid over a piece of flint. Now raise the bucket, swivel it, a dark oblong shape amongst the stars, against the stars, and try to ignore the steady throbbing pain in your neck, the way you're trying to ignore the even deeper throb of pain in your back. And dump it down in the ditch, covering the chunks of asphalt already there. Never mind, darling. You can bandage your hands when it's done. When he's done. She was in pieces. I croaked, and jock-eyed the bucket back into place so I could take another 200 pounds of dirt and gravel out of Dolan's grave. Now the time flies when you are having a good time. Moments after I had noticed the first faint streaks of light in the east, I got down to another measurement of the floor's incline with the carpenter's level. I was actually getting near the end. I thought I might just make it. I knelt, and as I did, I felt something in my back let go. It went with a dull little snap. I uttered a guttural cry and collapsed on my side of the narrow. Sorry, guys. I sighed on the narrow, slanted floor of the excavation. Lips pulled back from my teeth, hands pressing into the small of my back. Little by little, the very worst of the pain passed and I was able to get to my feet. All right, I thought, that's it. It's over. It was a good try, but it's over. Please, darling, Elizabeth whispered back. Impossible as it would have been to believe once upon a time, that whispering voice had begun to take on an unpleasant undertone in my mind. There was a sense of monstrous implacability about it. Please don't give up. Please go on. Go on digging. I don't even know if I can walk. But there's so little left to do, the voice wailed. It was no longer just the voice that spoke for Elizabeth. If it had ever been, it was Elizabeth. So little left, darling. I looked at my excavation in the growing light and nodded slowly. She was right. The bucket loader was only 5 feet from the end. 7 at most. But it was the deepest 5 or 7, of course. Fuck. The 5 or 7 with the most dirt in them. You can do it, darling. I know you can. Softly cajoling. But it was not really her voice that persuaded me to go on. What really turned the trick was an image of Dolan lying asleep in his penthouse while I stood here in this hole beside a stinking, rumbling bucket loader, covered in dirt, my hands in flaps and ruins. Dolan sleeping in silk pajama bottoms with one of his blondes asleep beside him, wearing only the top. Downstairs, in the glassed-in executive section of the parking garage, the Cadillac, already loaded with luggage, would be gassed and ready to go. All right then, I said. I climbed slowly back into the bucket loader's seat and revved the engine. I kept on until 9 o'clock and then I quit. There were other things to do and I was running out of time. My angled hole was 40 feet long. It would have to be enough. I drove the bucket loader back to its original spot and parked it. I would need it again. And that would mean siphoning more gas. But there was no time for that now. I wanted more Imperium. But there weren't many left in the bottle. And I would need them all later today and tomorrow. Oh yes, tomorrow, Monday, the glorious 4th. Instead of Empyrean, I took a 15-minute rest. I could ill afford the time, but I forced myself to take it just the same. I lay on my back in the van, my muscles jumping and twitching, imagining Dolan. He would be packing a few last-minute items in the travel. All now. Some papers to look over, a toilet kit, maybe a paperback book or a deck of cards. Suppose he flies this time. A malicious voice deep inside me whispered, and I couldn't help it. A moan escaped me. He had never flown to LA before. Always it had been the Cadillac. I had an idea he didn't like to fly. Sometimes he did, though. He had flown all the way to London once, and the thought lingered, itching and throbbing like a scaly patch of skin. It was 9:30 when I took out the roll of canvas and the big industry stapler and wooden struts. The day was overcast and a little cooler. God sometimes grants a favor. Up until then, I'd forgotten my bald head in consideration of larger agonies. But now, when I touched it with my fingers, I drew them away with a little hiss of pain. I looked at it in the outside passenger mirror and saw that it was a deep, angry red, almost a plum color. Back in Vegas, Dolan would be making last-minute phone calls. His driver would be bringing the Cadillac around front. There were only about 75 miles between me and it. And soon the Cadillac would start to close the distance at 60 miles an hour. I had no time to stand around, bemoaning my sunburned pate. "I love your sunburned pate, dear," Elizabeth said beside me. "Thank you, Beth," I said, and began taking the struts over to the hole. The work was now light compared to the digging I've done earlier, and the almost unbearable agony in my back subsided to a steady, dull throb. But what about later? That insinuating voice asked. What about that, Later would have to take care of itself, that was all. It was beginning to look as if the trap was going to be ready, and that was the important thing. The struts spanned the hole with just enough extra length to allow me to seat them tightly in the sides of the asphalt, which formed the top layer of my excavation. This was a job that would be tougher at night when the asphalt was hard. But now, at mid-morning, the stuff was sludgy, pliable, and it was like sticking pencils in wads of cooling toffee. When I had all the struts in, the hole had taken on the look of my original chalk diagram, minus the line down the middle. I positioned the heavy roll of canvas next to the shallow end of the hole and removed the hanks of rope that had tied it shut. Then I unrolled 42 feet of Route 71. Close up, the illusion was not perfect. A stage make. Up and set decoration is never perfect from the first 3 rows. But from even a few yards away, it was virtually undetectable. It was a dark gray strip which matched the actual surface of Route 71 exactly. On the left of the canvas strip, as you faced west, was a broken yellow passing line. I settled the long strip of canvas over the wooden understructure, then went slowly along the length of it, stapling the canvas to the struts. My hands didn't want to do the work, but I coaxed them. With the canvas secured, I returned to the van, slid behind the wheel. Sitting down caused another brief but agonizing muscle spasm, and drove back to the top of the rise. I sat there for a fun minute, looking down at my lumpy, wounded hands as they lay in my lap. Then I got out and looked back down Route 71, almost casually. I didn't want to focus on any one thing, you see. I wanted the whole picture. A gestalt, if you will. I wanted, as much as possible, to see the scene as Dolan and his men were going to see it when they come over the rise. I wanted to get an idea of how right or how wrong it was going to feel to them. What I saw looked better than I could have hoped. The road machinery at the far end of the straight stretch justified the piles of dirt that had come from my excavation. The asphalt chunks in the ditch were mostly buried. Some still showed. The wind was picking up, and it had blown the dirt around, but that looked like the remnants of an old paving job. The compressor I brought in the back of the van looked like highway department equipment. And from here, the illusion of the canvas strip was perfect. Route 71 appeared to be utterly untouched down there. Traffic had been heavy Friday and fairly heavy on Saturday. The drone of motors heading into the detour loop had been almost constant. This morning, however, there was hardly any traffic at all. Most people had gotten to wherever they intended to spend the 4th, or were taking the interstate 40 miles south to get there. That was fine with me. I parked the van just out of sight over the brow of the rise and lay on my belly until 10:45. Then after a big milk truck had gone down lumbering slowly up the detour, I backed the van down, opened the rear doors, and threw all the road cones inside. The flashing arrow was a tougher proposition. At first, I couldn't see how I was going to unhook it from the locked battery box without electrocuting myself. Then I saw the plug. It had been mostly hidden by a hard rubber O-ring on the side of a sign case. A little insurance policy against vandals, impractical jokers, who might find pulling the plug on such a highway sign an amusing prank, I supposed. I found a hammer and a chisel in my toolbox. If four hard blows were sufficient to split the O-ring, I yanked it off with a pair of pliers and pulled the cable free. The arrow stopped flashing and went dark. I pushed the battery box into the ditch and buried it. It was strange to stand there and hear it humming down there in the sand, but it made me think of Dolan, and that made me laugh. I didn't think Dolan would hum. He might scream, but I didn't think he would hum. 4 bolts held the arrow in a low steel cradle. I loosened them as fast as I could, ears cocked for another motor. It was time for one, but not time for Dolan yet, surely. That got the interior pessimist going again. What if he flew? He doesn't like to fly. What if he's driving but going another way? Going by the interstate, for instance. Today everyone else is. He always goes by 71. Yes, but what if? Shut up, I hissed. Shut up, damn you. Just shut the fuck up. Easy, darling, easy. Everything will be alright. I got the arrow into the back of the van. It crashed against the sidewall and some of the bulbs broke. More of them broke when I tossed the cradle in after it. With that done, I drove back up to the rise, pausing at the top to look behind me. I had taken away the arrow and the cones. All that remained now was that big orange warning, road closed, use detour. There was a car coming. It occurred to me that if Dolan was early, it had all been for nothing. The goon driving would simply turn down the detour, leaving me to go mad out here in the desert. It was a Chevrolet. My heart slowed down, and I let out a long, shuddering breath. But there was no more time for nerves. I drove back to where I had parked to look at my camouflage job and parked there again. I reached under the jumble of stuff in the back of the van and got the jack. Grimly ignoring my screaming back, I jacked up the rear end of the van, loosening the lug nuts on the back tire they would see when they came, and tossed it into the back of the van. More glass broke. And I would just have to hope there had been no damage done to the tire. I didn't have a spare. I went back to the front of the van, got my old binoculars, and then headed back towards the detour. I passed it and got to the top of the next rise as fast as I could. A shambling trout was really all I could manage by this time. Once at the top, I trained my binoculars east. I had a 3-mile field of vision and could see snatches of the road for 2 miles east of that. 6 vehicles were currently on the way, strung out like random beads on a long string. The first was a foreign car. Datsun or Subaru, I thought. Less than a mile away. Beyond that was a pickup. And beyond the pickup was what looked like a Mustang. The others were just desert. Light flashing on chrome and glass. When the first car neared, it was a Subaru. I stood up and stuck my thumb out. I didn't expect a ride looking the way I did. And I wasn't disappointed. The expensively coiffed woman behind the wheel took one horrified glance, and her face snapped shut like a fist. Then she was gone, down the hill and onto the detour. Get a bath, baby, the driver of the pickup yelled at me half a minute later. The Mustang actually turned out to be an Escort. It was followed by a Plymouth. The Plymouth by a Winnebago. That sounded as if it were full of kids having a pillow fight. No sign of Dolan. I looked at my watch. 11:25 a.m. If he was going to show up, it ought to be very soon. This was prime time. The hands on my watch moved slowly around to 11:40, and there was still no sign of him. Only a late model Ford and a hearse as black as a rain cloud. He's not coming. He went by the interstate, or he flew. No, he'll come. He won't, though. You were afraid he'd smell you, and he did. That's why he changed his pattern. There was another twinkle of light on a chrome in the distance. This car was a big one. Big enough to be a Cadillac. I lay on my belly. elbows propped in the grit of the shoulder, binoculars to my eyes. The car disappeared behind a rise, re-emerged, slipped around a curve, and then came out again. It was a Cadillac. All right, but it wasn't gray. It was a deep mint green. What followed was the most agonizing 30 seconds of my life. 30 seconds that seemed to last for 30 years. Part of me decided on the spot, completely and irrevocably, that Dolan had traded in his old Cadillac for a new one. Certainly he had done this before, and although he had never traded for a green one before, there was certainly no law against it. The other half argued vehemently that Cadillacs were almost a dime a dozen on the highways and byways between Vegas and LA, and the odds against the green caddies being Dolan's Cadillac were 100 to 1. Sweat ran into my eyes, blurring them, and I put the binoculars down. They weren't going to help me solve this one, anyhow. By the time I was able to see the passengers, it was too late. It would be too late. It's almost too late now. Go down there and dump the detour signs. You're gonna miss them. Let me tell you what you're going to catch in your trap if you hide that sign now. 2 rich old people going to LA to see their children and take their grandkids to Disneyland. Do it. It's him. It's the only chance you're going to have. That's right. The only chance. So don't blow it by catching the wrong people. It's Dolan. It's not. Stop it, I moaned, holding my head. Stop it. Stop it. I could hear the motor now. Dolan. The old people. The lady. The tiger. Dolan. The old. Elizabeth, help me, I groaned. Darling, that man has never owned a green Cadillac in his life. He never would. Of course it's not him. The pain in my head cleared away. I was able to get to my feet and get my thumb out. It wasn't the old people. And it wasn't Dolan either. It was what looked like 12 Vegas Corines crowded, in which one old boy, who was wearing the biggest cowboy hat and the darkest Foster Grants I'd ever seen. One of the Corines mooned me as the green Cadillac went fishtailing onto the detour. Slowly, feeling entirely washed out, I raised the binoculars again and saw him coming. There was no mistaking that Cadillac. As it came around the curve at the far end of my uninterrupted view of the road, it was as gray as the sky overhead. But it stood out with startling clarity against the dull brown rises of the lands to the east. It was him, Dolan. My long moments of doubt and indecision seemed both remote and foolish in an instant. It was Dolan, and I didn't have to see that gray Cadillac to know it. I didn't know if he could smell me, but I could smell him. Knowing he was on the way made it easier to pick up my aching legs and run. I got back to the big detour sign and shoved it face down into the ditch. I shook a sand-colored piece of canvas over it, then pawed loose sand over its support post. The overall effect wasn't as good as the fake strip on the road, but I thought it would serve. Stripe, not strip. Doesn't matter. Now I ran up the second rise to where I had left the van, which was just another part of a picture now. A vehicle temporarily abandoned by the owner, who had gone off somewhere to either get a new tire or have an old one fixed. I got into the cab and stretched out across the seats, my heart thumping. Again, time seemed to stretch out. I lay there listening for the engine, and the sound didn't come and didn't come and didn't come. They turned off. He got wind of you at the last moment anyway, or something looked hinky. Either to him or to the one of his men. And they turned off. I lay on the seat, my back throbbing in long, slow waves. My eyes squinched tightly shut, as if that would somehow help me hear better. Was that an engine? No, just the wind, now blowing hard enough to drive an occasional sheet of sand against the side of the van. Not coming. Turned off or turned back. Just the wind. Turned off or turned beat. No, it was not just the wind. It was a motor. The sound of it was swelling, and a few seconds later a vehicle, one single vehicle, rushed past me. I sat up and grabbed the wheel. I had to grab something. And stared out through the windshield, my eyes bulging, my tongue caught between my teeth. The gray Cadillac floated down the hill towards the flat stretch, doing 50 or maybe a little more. The brake lights never went on, not even at the end. They never saw it. Never had so much as the slightest idea. What happened was this. All at once the Cadillac seemed to be driving through the road instead of on it. This illusion was so persuasive that I felt a moment of confused vertigo, even though I had created an illusion myself. Dolan's Cadillac was hubcap deep in Route 71, and then it was up to the door panels. A bizarre thought occurred to me. If GM Company made luxury submarines, this is what they would look like going down. I could hear thin, snapping sounds as the struts supporting the canvas broke under the car. I could hear the sound of the canvas rippling and ripping. All of it happened in only 3 seconds. But they are 3 seconds I will remember my whole life. I had an impression of a Cadillac now running with only its roof and the top 2 or 3 inches of the polarized windows visible. And then there was a big, toneless thud, and the sound of breaking glass and crippling metal. A large puff of dust rose in the air and the wind pulled it apart. I wanted to go down there. Wanted to go down right away. But first I had to put the detour to rights. I didn't want us to be interrupted. I got out of the van, went around to the back and pulled the tire back out. I put it on the wheel and tightened the 6 lug nuts as fast as I could, using only my fingers. I could do more thorough job later. In the meantime, I only needed to back the van down to the place where the detour diverged from Highway 71. I jacked the bumper down and hurried back to the cab of the van at the limping run. I paused there for a moment, listening, head cocked. I could hear the wind. And from the long rectangular hole in the road, the sound of someone shouting. Or maybe screaming. Grinning, I got back in the van. I backed rapidly down the road, the van swinging drunkenly back and forth. I got out, opened the back doors and put out the traffic cones again. I kept my ear cocked for approaching traffic, but the wind had gotten too strong to make that very worthwhile. By the time I heard an approaching vehicle, it would be practically on top of me. I started down into the ditch, tripped, landed on my Pratt and slid to the bottom. I pushed away the sand-colored pieces of canvas and dragged the big detour sign up to the top. I set it up again, then went back to the van and slammed the rear doors closed. I had no intentions of trying to set the arrow sign up again. I drove back over the next rise, stopped in my old place, just out of sight of the detour, go out and tighten in the lug nuts on the van's back wheels, using the tire iron this time. The shouting had stopped, but there was no longer any questions about the screaming. It was much louder. Alright guys, so a continuation from page 126 of Dolan's Cadillac will be coming. So stay tuned for that. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.